Welcome to the Integrative Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. In this podcast, the best of both worlds of medicine come together, informing you of your healthcare options. This podcast is for the ultra-discerning, highly critical, and results-oriented health consumer, filtering out the good, the bad, and the real ugly when it comes to health information. As your host, my mission is to help you navigate the world of evidence-based integrative care and confidently make choices to help you live your best life. Enjoy!
Okay, so welcome to this episode of the Integrative Medicine Podcast. Today I have a guest interviewed. It's Carly Crawford. She's a registered psychotherapist in Burlington and Stony Creek in Ontario. And her focus of her practice is mostly in disordered eating. And so we wanted to have this conversation, and Carly and I have been sort of connecting online over the last year or so and share some mutual patients in Burlington, and really felt like this conversation was a very important one to be had around sort of dysfunctional patterns of behavior that often are presenting in women that, you know, maybe visually don't sort of fit what we would typically think of as a quote-unquote disordered eating, and yet they have a really dysfunctional relationship with food that's starting to show up in other areas of their health, which is where I end up often working with them. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Carly.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I would love for you to just give us a little bit of background about yourself, because you have such a great background and experience in working in all sorts of different settings around disordered eating. So I'd love for you to just give us a bit of an outline of what your career has looked like and what it looks like now, because some of the programs that you run now are just fantastic too.
Sure. So I started off in the not-for-profit industry. So I used to run Danielle's Place, which is a eating disorder support and resource center in Burlington. At the time, back in, 2008, 2007, we used to treat adults and kids that have eating disorders. It's since changed and it's only treating kids now. And basically that's where I started working with individuals that could drop in at any time for free services around individuals that were diagnosed with eating disorders. So we saw people everywhere from kind of Barrie to London, Toronto, all over, because the support for these illnesses and related illnesses are extremely lacking. It was there that I kind of figured out that I wanted to do more one-on-one work, and since then I've been practicing in private practice, doing psychotherapy mostly for people that have diagnosed eating disorders. So that's everything from anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, which is the most commonly diagnosed eating disorder, and kind of everything in between. So from there, kind of recognizing through working with lots of different organizations, being a big advocate for mental health resources and trying to do everything that I can to bring awareness through things like this. So going and doing trainings with different types of doctors, dental hygienists, all sorts of different things to bring awareness about signs and symptoms and things to look for. Because as you said, eating disorders don't just look like a certain thing that we're kind of taught that they do, or kind of making assumptions that they do. And they never exist kind of in a vacuum. So if someone is diagnosed with an eating disorder, chances are they have depression, they have anxiety, they have trauma, they have other things that definitely warrant treatment. So it's a population that definitely holds a place in my heart. I don't think that I would have gone into this field if I didn't myself have an eating disorder. I just think that it's not really an illness that people really naturally tend to go towards in terms of the therapy world. So that is part of my experience that I'm open about as a clinician, which is not always the case. And so now I'm kind of working on, because of the need, which is so great. Unfortunately, our healthcare system doesn't have a lot of accessible programs for people that are battling eating disorders. So trying to work with other not-for-profits to help with their programming, as well as doing some workshops when I can, and kind of build up and do more supervision so that other clinicians have more of a sense of how to treat this illness.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I think when it's interesting you bring up, the dental hygienists and thinking about like all the different practitioners, like in theory, I think every healthcare provider is seeing some angle or aspect of disordered eating when it's presenting in their patient, right? Whether it's, and assuming we're talking about like, even like eroded teeth and things that will show up in patients that are maybe getting seen by other healthcare practitioners, but perhaps glossed over, right? Or areas of their health that is an area of their health that is not being examined well. I think what sparked our want to have this conversation is that in integrative medicine, often our solutions for patients end up being nutritional in nature, and that can certainly create a complication for patients who already have that tendency towards dysfunctional patterns of thought around food. So I'm thinking specifically around things like restrictive diets, removing foods from the diet, etc. I think that's partly what sparked this conversation for us, was that, in my world and integrative medicine, and certainly in the online space, which is hopefully something we'll also kind of tackle today, patients are being bombarded with ideas about how to treat themselves, or they're seeing practitioners whose background is in treatment that involves food restriction. And for that population that's relatively at risk, I think that's going to create some problems.
Absolutely. And I think that that's where it's so nice that we connected, because it is important to have a naturopathic doctor that you can refer to, that you trust is going to have some background in this, right? Because it is often something that we see. And to be honest, it's other therapists as well, right? So other therapists that are treating individuals that come to them with other mental health issues that need to know the right questions to ask, because these lifestyle things are things that we don't always probe and ask about, like how is your eating, how is your relationship with your food, and it's often there, right? And it's often something that people don't have any idea is impacting them. So having that, what you were saying about kind of that prescribing the restricting dieting and that sort of thing, it's often something that when someone comes into my office, they've said, I was told to do this and now I'm kind of here, right?
So one of the things that I wanted us to go through, because I think people listening to the podcast, it's easy to kind of think, well, that's not me, right? Like I don't have an eating disorder, I don't have a, dysfunctional patterns of thought, or I don't have those problems. I just want to lose weight, or I just want, right? Like, I think it's easy for us to assume that we're not in that camp, right? But I think patients maybe deeply know that they have some, poor relationship with food. Where are we drawing those lines, or what kinds of things can patients think about to themselves to help them understand what their relationship with food is like? So I think we can look up the diagnostic criteria for disordered eating, but I think it's those subtle challenges or thoughts that patients have that are probably walking that line of disordered eating, and yet maybe can't self-identify that that's part of their challenge. So what are we looking for in patients to maybe sort of raise our eyebrows or raise some flags that patients may need more support?
Absolutely. I think one of the most basic thing that I get people to kind of reflect on is how much time in the day are you thinking about food and weight and shape, and how much, if you were to do some sort of inventory of how often are you thinking about other things, and how much are you thinking about what are you going to eat, what you just ate, how you feel in your body, and just the amount of time your head is spent in that place and what it takes away from in terms of other things that you have in your life, and very quickly doing that inventory. And if you were to think about, if you were thinking about your job that much, or if you were thinking about a fear of, I'm not sure, spiders that much, you would know that it was a problem. The challenge with eating disorders and disordered eating is that we've normalized it as a culture to think about food and weight and shape and health. It's a good thing, right? It's everywhere. We're surrounded by it. And so a lot of people that I see don't think that it's problematic because everyone they're surrounded with is talking about food. Everyone they're surrounded with is talking about the latest weight loss, and that's especially bad right now. So I think measuring the amount of time that you're thinking about these things and how much you're thinking about it, and kind of how that makes you feel in terms of thoughts about it, right? So even if it's making you feel, I would argue that even if you're thinking about it, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's causing you to feel really low or feeling really anxious, just the fact that you're almost obsessing over it is usually a pretty good indicator that there's something going on there. Other things like just having an exorbitant amount of health food rules, right, that you have to kind of follow in order for you to feel good, that may or may not be taking away from other aspects of your life, like not being able to do things because you have to eat a certain way, that can be a red flag as well. And I think that our relationships with our bodies, which is really complex, but how you're feeling in regards to your self-worth against your body and how obsessive those thoughts can be. And I guess the worth that you place on yourself. And we always say that food has no moral ground, right? That you're not a bad person if you ate something that is off your required meal plan, right? So how you're feeling in terms of how can you kind of look at food in a more balanced way. Those are all ways that I would those are flags that I would consider in terms of things that people I feel have really normalized.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point, like that sort of like normalizing those behaviors. And certainly like in my industry, that is prolific, right? It's prolific in the content people put out online. It's prolific in treatment plans coming out of practitioners' offices, in books that people are reading, and that it's really setting the stage that restriction is treatment and restriction is the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not doing some kind of restriction, you must not have looked at your food closely enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's that whole idea of like clean eating and whether or not that's, is that doing more harm than good, right? And I think it's going to be really challenging for us to figure that out. Like what kind of harm is being created by the concept that you need to eat cleanly, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how we'll measure that over time, but that's, something that at least I'm seeing as part of, some of the challenges in patients getting good evidence-based integrative care, is that so much of the prescriptions are based on restriction when truly we don't have a lot of evidence for individual foods being as problematic as they are being presented by most practitioners,
Wow.
right?
Yeah. It's so nice to hear you say that. To be honest, no, it is. It's because it's very difficult as a practitioner that works with this population, because I'm not a doctor the way that you are. So I can't, when somebody comes into my office and says, I can't eat this because it causes this, this, and that, I don't really know the answer to that question, right? Mm-hmm. Do I know what that's going to do to you psychologically from that kind of, eating disorders themselves are anxiety-based illnesses. So these individuals are fearful of making these changes with their food and fearful of that food. And I don't know whether that reason why they are is valid or not. Right. And that's why it's nice to have a practitioner that I can say, okay, how real is this? Should they be following it or not? Right? Because right. I find it to be a very confusing time. And I can say I've been doing this for 12 years. And I've never been so confused.
It's not getting clearer as we go. No. And I think that access to information is tough. I always think about my parents' generation partly is that critical appraisal was not a skill that was even necessary as part of their education. And then we gave them the internet, right? And so even just trying to help patients understand, and that was one of the purposes of this podcast in the first place, was how do we help equip patients to be better, like more critical and better educated about how to consume information online? And then the other side of it is how do we enable patients to be advocates for themselves so they can get the care they need? Because like we said earlier, like patients that are otherwise well, maybe otherwise have an appropriate BMI, maybe who don't have too many other health consequences as a result of their disordered eating, and yet, right, are they truly healthy? Yeah. Those patients are not accessing care. So, and that's, I think where we've worked well together is that looking at some of those like more, I call it them like hidden criteria for disordered eating, where patients might be able to start to recognize some of those thoughts in themselves. And I like that, sort of evaluation on the amount of time that patients are spending on food. I imagine people saying, but right? Like, and sort of having contrary statements to that. What do you think about that? So when I say like, well, how much time are you spending on food? And they'll say, well, I'm thinking about it all the time, but I have to lose weight, or but I need, right? Like,
yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's part of it, as well as the other thing that I hear a lot is, but I've always thought that way. That's been my life, right? So it's very difficult for people to see that could be pathological. Like, okay, what do you mean? Like, you don't think about food? So that's a question that they get all the time, right? And it's kind of trying to I had a phone call with somebody on Friday, and she's like, I don't really think that I have a problem, but I can't stop. Like, it's waking me up at night. I'm thinking about food. She was like talking about how old she was and her weight, and she's like, this isn't something that would affect me. I'm too old for that, but what do I need to do about it, right? And what we see is that there's a lot of science behind when you are restricting and you're just not getting enough of what you need, you do have more obsessive thoughts. So it's hard to kind of get people to see how and to kind of buy into the idea that, okay, this could be something that's affecting you, right? The other thing that I didn't mention that I should have is some of the hidden signs is mood fluctuations, right? So people experiencing anxiety for the first time in other aspects of their life, or people feeling extraordinarily agitated, and those sorts of things that you don't necessarily always think to ask. Like, let's look at what you've been doing with your food, right? So that's another piece that I didn't mention.
That's important. I think too, just that whole concept of like premenstrual exacerbation, that, PMS will exacerbate most mental health. And I asked you off recording what that experience is like, because there's certainly appetite fluctuation with your cycle, but knowing that it's rooted in the mental health component of the patient's health, that it's interesting because their mood will be worse, right, during PMS, which we see with other mood disorders too.
Right.
That patients are more depressed during PMS, they have more anxiety during PMS, and more triggering, sort of behaviors during PMS, even if maybe their actual appetite has gone up, which I think the evidence for food restriction in PMS is really significant. So one of our treatments for PMS is to alleviate restriction in the diet, because women who do restrict carbohydrates have worse PMS. So it's interesting because something may often get flagged as PMS, and maybe even I'm at risk of having made that error. We're flagging it as PMS when perhaps the restriction itself is actually the root of what's going on with those patients.
Right. No, that's interesting, because that's something that I try to tell people all of the time. It's just this idea that you need to have that balanced diet. You need to have those carbohydrates, and you need to have that to feed your brain, especially if you are more predisposed to suffering with these types of things, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, when I'm coaching patients around their weight, but also trying to work through some of their thoughts and behaviors about food, we have to look for other health metrics to try and help them latch on to something other than their weight, or something other than their diet, like their strength, like their energy, their sleep quality. Is that a useful tool for patients to consider? Because I was thinking about the person you just mentioned. You said, well, I've always thought that way. I've always had to watch my weight, quote unquote.
Right.
Can we rewrite that story for those patients? I mean, I know that's a very complicated question, but how are we, what should patients be sort of thinking about instead of their weight and their food?
So oftentimes I think that the less optimistic, I guess, outlook is that unfortunately what we know about, if someone has a diagnosed eating disorder and it's been there for a really long time, the chances of them being able to kind of completely live their life without this is hard, right? Because your brain has been with this illness for so long. What we do know, or what I see, and I've seen it actually a lot in this last 6 months, is that with some really good psychoeducation around, okay, this is why you're thinking about food so much. This is the evidence that we have to show us this. Let's do an experiment to see what happens when we start to change those behaviors. And you can get people to kind of through strategies like cognitive behavioral therapy and those sorts of things, they can see that, holy crap, like I'm not thinking about food so much. My brain is not starving and I'm not thinking about food so much. So sometimes that can be quite a lovely shift to see, right? Eating disorders are quite complex in that if there's lots of other elements that make it harder, then it's going to be harder for them to see that shift to not thinking about food so much, right? But the first step that I would focus on is getting people to kind of understand and kind of buy into the idea that this is why your brain is working like this, right? This is why, for whatever reason, whether it's been triggered by something, whether there's been a change in weight one way or another, right? Sometimes those can be aspects that impact, right?
Right, and I think where I see it show up for women, so underfueling for women in general is challenging. It shows up hormonally in women quite a bit. So we always think of the young woman who loses her period as a competitive gymnast. Certainly women are still at risk for cycle disruption when they are underfueling. So they may skip a period, they may have a period come twice in the same month, and when we trace it back, it's when, I watched such and such documentary on Netflix and now I have such and such, which shall remain unnamed, diet pattern, and since then I've only had 2 or 3 cycles and I should have had 8. Right? So that's where it starts to show up. Certainly the PMS piece, women will experience more PMS than they ever have before. Or they may start to see breakthrough symptoms of menopause because of the low estrogen levels. Once women, that underfueling can bring on those menopausal symptoms, and it may only be a few days a month. It's often the last few days of their cycle right before their period, but they may struggle with more insomnia during that time. They may have breakthrough hot flashes during that time. And that's something to make note of, right? If they're otherwise well and they're otherwise healthy, 38-year-old woman really shouldn't be having hot flashes as part of her PMS experience. I certainly want to look at underfueling as being one of the problems, but that often is what gets brought into my office is the cycle disruption. And I even have cases where they've worked previously with other practitioners for various health concerns, and then they come to see me for their hormones, and it's, things have not been quite right since I did a, parasite cleanse with such and such practitioner I found online. And when we dive deeper, it turns out that the level of restriction that's in their diet is actually causing their brain to respond as if they're like being completely underfueled.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes we're able to see that and see individuals take that information with a grain of salt, right? And say, okay, I need to do a little bit of what that physician has told me, but I'm not going to go to that extreme. But you get a person with a certain type of personality, a certain predisposition, and it's going to be really difficult for them to unlearn those behaviors. And that's where we see some really problematic things, right? So you see some individuals that have, gone wherever and had a certain protocol introduced, and it's 10 years later and they're still kind of saying, but I was told this, and they're not able to see kind of the ramifications of that, right? And that's a really sad situation to kind of try to get them to unlearn whatever those patterns are.
And with the amount of information that's online, it's confusing, the amount of information that's available for patients. And if they have those underlying tendencies, that's going to reinforce for them that restriction is king, right? You can go anywhere on Instagram or Facebook and download someone's free PDF on how to completely screw up your diet, right? With through restriction. But if patients can't self-identify that that's a triggering experience for them, or that they even maybe have those tendencies in the first place, they're going to just consume that information, and it's completely reinforcing something they already believe. It's like watching patients go from, and I'm not saying that these diets are wrong per se, but watching patients transition from the ketogenic diet to the carnivore diet, it's reinforcing them that they're only supposed to eat 5 or 6 foods, right. By having these new diets and these new concepts be supported online or advertised online. I'm sure that your experience over the last few years with the amount of online content. Like, how are you navigating that with your audience?
You just touched on a point that I need to come back to as well, that how I navigate it, I find that I get very easily overwhelmed, right? So I find that it's a lot of education around, like, okay, you need to be seeing a doctor that is going to have some background in terms of, so for clients that already identify of having an eating disorder, that it's very important that the person that they see understands that and knows that, so that whatever protocol they're being given is really based on, I guess, some education around how dangerous it would be for that person to engage in that, right? In terms of how to navigate it, I think that I talk a lot to my clients about how the dieting industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that a lot of these things are trying to get you to kind of buy into something, and that we're addicted as human beings to getting fast results, right? And so a lot of these things are based on, if you do these things, that you're going to see a result and it's going to be quick, but at what cost, right? How is this going to? And so talking to people a lot about, for the individuals that I work with that have been on every diet in the book and as a result, unfortunately, are struggling a lot with being quite overweight, because their body is so freaking confused because they've never fed it properly, and continuously going and kind of consuming these, okay, but maybe I should try this, right? And they send it to me. This one seems like it might be a good one, Carly. Like, it seems balanced. And just kind of putting it back to them to think about how that's really going to impact the way that their brain functions, right?
Right.
I think the other part that we haven't really touched on is that, and I don't imagine it's easy for people to talk about this in your office, is that it's really difficult for people to talk about the fact that a lot of these restrictive diets cause binge eating, and kind of this cycle of eventually the individuals that go on binges that are, eating thousands and thousands of calories of food because their body just needs that food, and kind of the guilt and shame that creates, that is really difficult for people to talk about. And oftentimes, to be honest, is what brings people into my office, is when they're in that restriction stage, when they're following their protocols and everything is going great and their weight is going down, they feel like $1 million. So they're not going to seek out any psychotherapy. It's when they perceive they've failed and I've gone off, right? And
I need to get back on track. I need someone to hold me accountable.
Yes.
These are the phrases that patients will use with me,
right?
When they're in that part of the phase, right? And I think it's interesting because the research on, caloric deficit, even from a health perspective, we're starting to see more and more evidence around cyclic dieting as being a positive thing, where we don't restrict patients all the time, right? And we encourage patients to, I always talk about it in my office, patients need to feel happy and full. And if we're not fitting those two things, we're having a very short conversation or a very short-term outlook when it comes to their health, which, when I put it back to them, like, most of those programs and things that they're, consuming online have some kind of end date, right? It's 21 days of smoothies. It's the 48-hour something detox. When they've put a timeline on that, we're recognizing that amount of restriction is just impossible for humans to maintain, and probably isn't healthy for humans to maintain. But yet, when those 21 days are over, they're very quickly looking for their next 21-day fix, right? Whereas when we look at the longevity around health, most of the evidence is pointing towards more flexibility, more honoring, season of a patient's life, and how important it is for them to be able to fuel themselves properly depending on what their needs are. And so it's not actually evidence-based to do any of those things, nor is it evidence-based to take out as many foods as being suggested to take foods out, right? Like, there's very few diagnoses that truly benefit from restriction. And even then, sometimes, so a great example is polycystic ovaries. There's a little bit of data that maybe cheese worsens their acne, but there's also some data that if we feed some women cheese, they actually just eat more healthy all the time because they're happy. And so how do we navigate that, right?
It's just so refreshing to hear from you, honestly. It is, because I think that it's so... I don't think these conversations are happening in a lot of doctors' offices, right? So I think it's very difficult for people that are desperate and they go in and they want the help to be able to get some really balanced advice, right?
I always say to patients, I don't want to be in their life for 21 days, right? Like if that is what happens, I feel like I've lost the potential, like for the kind of like relationship and benefit that they can have, that we're looking on like such longer timelines. How can women get support? So, sort of trying to close the loop on it. So we know that support is poor, especially for the otherwise well woman who maybe doesn't fit the archetype of the traditional eating disordered woman, or what we would imagine her to appear or even present. So we know that the care is poor. We know that many women are not even that like self-identifying that they're having too many challenges with eating, and they're also getting so much information online that's reinforcing that they're, and normalizing, I liked that word that you used, it's normalizing their thoughts. And yet, from a health perspective, it's very consequential. So even like the cycle disruption is important, but that's maybe even like, that's just tip of the iceberg, right? Of the amount of dysfunction that a woman's body will endure when she's being underfueled. So what do we do, right? Like what's a good action step for women to take who are listening and sort of going, you know what, like she's like, I do think about food all the time, and I have spent the last 20 years dieting, and I do have a really dysfunctional relationship with nutrition. Like what do they do? What do we do now?
It's a hard question to answer, right? Because I wish I could say, find someone who specializes in this and go and speak to someone, right? So I think it's what we can focus on that is within our control and is accessible to everyone is just really be mindful of what you're consuming, and so in terms of information, right? So having a good, just really reflecting on kind of what are you including in your life that is potentially enabling these thoughts and feelings around being obsessed with everything that we just finished talking about, and what can we do to kind of support you having this be less of a role in your life, right? And so this is kind of looking at being able to, whether it's doing some self-diagnosis around, okay, so do I think that I'm meeting the criteria of something that really warrants me to go and talk to somebody? Am I even ready for that? That's another conversation, right? Because I think that we're not talking even just necessarily about people that are under eating. We're also talking about people that might be overeating, right? And so the shame that comes with being somebody that's maybe not fitting, maybe being overweight and saying I'm restricting all of the time, right? Because I'm kind of stuck in this cycle, and going and getting that help, it's really not there anymore, right? So we don't have even practitioners, like my little group of kind of community of therapists that are able to treat this are getting smaller and smaller, because the number of people that are starting to realize that they have a problem are increasing, right? So I think that number one in an ideal situation is being able to sit down and talk to somebody that is going to be able to have a good understanding of what this whole disordered eating disorder world kind of looks like, to be able to get them to see that, okay, this is the role that it's playing in your life, right? And so there are some good websites that you can look at, finding a good practitioner that has some understanding of this. The NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center is one. That's a great hub that has some really good information around like signs and symptoms to look for, like that sort of thing in terms of support. Local organizations like Body, Brave, and that sort of thing are doing some really great work around health at every size, and looking at all of their services are really accessible for people with all sorts of eating disorders. So what we do find in our community is that a lot of support is designed for people that are struggling with something that would be looking more like anorexia, versus what we see that's actually most people are struggling with the other types of eating disorders, right? So it's a tough thing to kind of navigate right now in terms of that support world, right? Because we don't have a lot out there, but really making sure that that is part of an individual's expertise when you do look, if you are ready to take that step to sit down with a clinician, right?
And we can put some of the links to some of those resources in the show notes, so you can link right to them. I think where I would come at it from a more like a cynical perspective is what you don't want to do.
That's what you have more control over.
That's like when we're missing care, right? And so these patients are in limbo where they don't have the support they need, but yet there is a plethora of things they could do that are destructive, as far as like consuming content, like we said, and whatnot. So I definitely try and educate my patients who I think are at risk, or women who we think are going to be triggered by certain conversations about food or conversations about nutrition. We're very careful about the way we deliver that programming around nutrition to those patients, and having good conversations about where they get that information from, right? Like, do not do an online cleanse. Do not see a practitioner who's, the kind of diet they do is in the bio of their Instagram, right? Because you're going to connect with someone who has a very limited and narrow-minded view of nutrition and eating, and that is going to, again, reinforce their thoughts and behaviors that there's something wrong with the way that they're eating, right? So I think there's things, like it's almost easier to avoid the wrong care than it is to get the right care, right? And so I think if women are really honest with themselves about the kind of support that they may need from someone that works in the integrative space or works in the food space, and it'd be the same as having a conversation about, like, if someone wanted you to, do some meal planning and it was going to take you 25 hours worth of food prep a week, we'd all be very quick to say, I don't have that kind of time, right? Like, I can never make these amazing dishes that need 35 ingredients. We need to have the same level of introspection about whether or not the diet plan you're signing up for is triggering from a mental health perspective. And when you go to click follow, or when you're trying to connect with someone that's providing really some medical advice that it's not appropriate, right, for that particular patient. I think it's sad that that's the easier thing to do, is the unfollow, the disassociate.
I think it's the reality though, right? I think that, the other part of this is that what we haven't really touched on as of yet is that the disordered eating is often just the coping mechanism, right? So it's not a terrible idea in terms of, if it is something that you've identified in somebody that you're working with, or something that you've self-identified as that you're struggling with, to just go and sit down with a psychotherapist or somebody that specializes in emotional and mental health, just to check in with kind of how you're at in your life. Because chances are, it's related back to something, whether that's high anxiety or you're going through a stressful period in your life, and the person doesn't necessarily have to be, a specialist, so to speak, to talk just in general about our emotional health. And I think that that's something that people, no matter how many Bell Let's Talk days are kind of going around, are still feeling very fearful of making that a priority in their health. So just being able to sit down and have those conversations with somebody is super important, right?
I was going to ask that. I was going to say, do we have evidence that just generalized cognitive behavioral therapy is a positive thing for patients, even if the person they're working with doesn't even touch on right? Maybe they're not quite even ready to have a conversation about food because they can't even imagine who they are or what their life looks like without those strategies that they're using, but can identify that maybe there's some other underlying anxiety or depression or mood disorders that could use some support. So that was going to be one of my questions. So even just getting any mental health support at all would be positive.
I think so. And I say that a little bit hesitantly, right? Because we're talking about a huge spectrum of illnesses here, right? So or illness in general. So you definitely, if you're in certain spaces in your eating disorder and that you're highly symptomatic and that it's very difficult for you to function in your life, you're finding it difficult to go a day without engaging in things, right? We've talked a lot about restriction here, but there's also, purging and all sorts of things that can wreak havoc on your ability. And if you're sitting with someone that isn't even going to touch on those things, it's going to be really difficult for you to kind of be able to get anything from it. But I do think that, and you would probably see a lot of that population here, where we see a lot of people that are functioning with their anxiety or functioning with their depression, right? And so sitting down and talking to somebody about those sorts of things is definitely
it's possible.
beneficial. And it's beneficial because I always make the joke, I talk very little about food with the people that I work with. I actually hate talking about food because I'm not an expert in it, right? And so it's very much, usually at the beginning of our work, we're talking about dispelling things. And of course, if the individual is having a hard time getting out of the symptoms of their eating disorder, but then it's all the other stuff, right? That kind of made that individual more predisposed to engaging in this sort of thing.
I'm so appreciative of you sharing with our audience because I think this is a really important topic. And when we sat down and went through all the things we could talk about, I think we decided that this probably should be a longer conversation or there's more to even go through. But what I wanted to accomplish today was mostly looking at that sort of the lesser known sort of criteria or things that might be showing up in a woman's life that may be indicating that some of her behaviors and thoughts are a bit more problematic than she'd maybe been given sort of credit to, and also just reminding women that sometimes those hormonal symptoms that they're experiencing are coming as a result of underfueling and not necessarily her hormones per se, right? We always blame hormones for a lot of the way women feel, but if you're being treated for your PMS and nobody's asked you to look at caloric intake and, you know, and if you're secretly tracking your macros, or maybe not even that secretly, I'm just not sure that many doctors are asking about those questions. That those things can have a big influence on the hormonal system for women, and that's going to cause symptoms to start to break through. And then I think you gave us some really great tools around, you know, some of the things that people can think about that might be starting to indicate that they're having those problematic thoughts. Like I love that sort of amount of time of the day that you're thinking about it, and then also how much of your behavior is being modified because of those thoughts. Like how many things are you avoiding, or how many times are you having to make accommodation or adjustment for those thoughts. I think that's a really great sort of starting point for people to start to think about their relationship with food. And even just the automatic thoughts. I always find it funny when if I eat a donut at the gym, there's a lot of people that will make a comment about me eating a donut. And I think that's really interesting because it's really saying way more about how they feel about that donut than how I feel about the donut, right? But starting to recognize or identify those automatic thoughts about what that, where that's coming up for you in that space around food and nutrition, I think is really important. What are your sort of final thoughts, or what you would love to sort of let our listeners kind of go home with so that they can have some sort of food for thought about the topic?
This is so tough. I think the biggest things, and even just reflecting on what you were just saying, is that, what we have to also focus on is not just how much space these thoughts are taking up, but how you're feeling, right? So where your overall self-worth is, right? So at the end of the day, if you are feeling, that your mood is lower, or that you're having a really hard time with relationships and self-esteem and these things that are being impacted by your overall kind of view of yourself and your body and how you're taking care of your body, then that's problematic, right? We have to look at that a little bit deeper to say, okay, so why is this such a thing in your life that is taking up so much negative space, and how is that impacting kind of, we see such high levels, of anxiety and these sorts of things around things that are really unnecessary, right? That we shouldn't be stressing about, right? But sometimes what we see is that it's easier for us to stress about kind of what we're putting in our body than some of these bigger problems that we have absolutely no control over, right? So that's another thing that we have to consider. I think in terms of final thoughts, I think that anything from just really being compassionate, because the reality is that a lot of us struggle with these thoughts about food, and a lot of us struggle with our thoughts about our body because it is something that is absolutely everywhere. And so really being able to be mindful of not saying, okay, well, I must not be perfect because I'm thinking these things, and being really hard on yourself about, okay, now I have this other thing that's wrong with me, and that it's really like we're living in a society that makes it almost impossible for us to think otherwise, right? So there's that I'm kind of picturing a meme that says like we're not taught how to love ourselves. We're taught how to be critical, and we're taught how to push harder. We're taught how to do things that kind of make us live this really controlled perfectionistic life, and these sort of diet protocols really fit nicely into that kind of category, and that's a lot of the personality type that we see as well. We didn't really touch on another thing that I wanted to mention is just this whole body positivity movement and that sort of thing. And I find that might be another thing to kind of talk about on another day, but it's often hard for the women that I see that are saying, well, I see all these women posting about how much they love their bodies and I don't, and I never will. And so this idea of body neutrality and kind of, you don't necessarily have to be in this place where you can post a picture in your underwear, but maybe we can get you not hating yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Or not having all of these self-defeating thoughts. So really trying to understand that this whole thing is this big, complicated spectrum, right? That when you look online in particular, which I think is just, we're talking about it a lot because it's the thing that's most accessible for people. It's hard not to get caught up in, I should be thinking like that. I should be doing all of these sorts of things, right? And in the eating disorder world, it's even hard for people because recovery looks a certain way, and it's hard. It's hard to navigate, right? Yeah.
I heard a great quote once about just like consuming online content that said, like, when you start your day, create before you consume. And I always loved that, because if that's the first thing you do in the morning is hop online, or when you're in a moment where you're not sure what to do or what to think, it's very easy for your thoughts and your behaviors to be swayed by all the things you see. But if you've spent some time in that creation mode as, what do I want? What do I enjoy? What am I grateful for? What are my goals? It's so much easier to, I mean, it's not easy, it's easier to hop online and look at something without it pulling you in a direction, right? You can look at it and just reflect on, oh, well, I said I wanted to be stronger, and now I see this person who I think looks better than I do. But I said I wanted to be stronger, right? It's you know, minutely easier to fall back to your goals. But if we don't have those goals, if we haven't thought about our health in that way, it's much easier to be pulled towards what we think en masse we should be doing, right? But certainly this is a very interesting and challenging topic. I so very much appreciate your expertise, and I'm sure we will have another time together because there's so many things that we could cover. Thank you so much for being a guest.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
This concludes our episode of the Integrative Medicine Podcast. As I strive to bring you the tools and advice you need to make well-educated healthcare choices, I hope you listen along. Questions about the podcast or topic requests can be forwarded to our email at imedresearchhub@gmail.com. Remember to subscribe to receive updates on the latest episodes through iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play.